Hello, my name is Heske. I'm part of the YSI management team, and I'm excited to welcome you here live from the Lighthouse for another Questions Fair session. This is the last Questions Fair session of the day, and not the first. It's been a wild day with tons and tons of stars beginning to populate the skies and lighting the sky up behind us. It's so thrilling to see everybody put their thoughts into these questions and start really working towards that final list of 100 questions that'll inspire and inform the work that we're about to do together in YSI. Now, next up, we're going to head to the constellation of globalization, where Shannon Monnat will speak to us to give us her input on what she thinks are the most pertinent questions of our time. But if you're new to this process and you want to know how you can participate and how you can put your direct input into the session, take a good look at this quick video. First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the Questions Fair, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find Questions Fair sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list. Great! So now that you know exactly how this works, I think you're ready for us to beam you over to the Globalization constellation. You will be welcomed by our questions moderator, Audra Aucoin.
Localize or globalize, localize or globalize, localize or globalize, interwoven or broken lines, globalize or localize, globalize or localize, globalize or localize. The globe is wide, I don't know your lives. Globalize or localize. Human beings are social. We gather to the center where the energy is focal. Let's share a Coca-Cola, give your selfhood to the total. But if everyone lives everywhere, then no one is at home though. Where you go depends on where you start. It's mega corporations and global markets. It's Darwinistic, it's are you fitter? The globe is big, but the market's bigger. How big's too big? How far's the chart of the growth extend? And when's it start to hold its stock but lose its heart? A unity that destroys its parts. Localize or globalize, localize or globalize, localize or globalize, interwoven or broken lines. Globalize or localize, globalize or localize, globalize or localize, or go for both with open eyes.
Welcome to our question session with Shannon Monnat. My name is Audra Aucoin, and I will be your question moderator. In order to guide future research aimed at providing the right answers, we must first ask the right questions. That is the main task of the YSI plenary, is to collaboratively formulate the most pertinent questions to be addressed in future research. This means the main task for both speakers and participants in the question session is not to answer the questions. Instead, the purpose is to contribute in finding and shaping research questions to guide future YSI projects. The first part of the session works as a questions incubator. In the graph, you'll see questions already submitted by Professor Monnat. While she's speaking, you're encouraged to suggest new questions and like questions suggested by others. The questions with the most likes will be presented to Professor Monnat for commentary, and then we will work on rephrasing those questions after her speech. After this session, our questions will have a chance to become one of the 100 most favorite questions of the plenary. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Nasaya to introduce our friend and speaker, Professor Shannon Monnat.
Hi everyone, my name is Natasha. I'm a coordinator at the Inequality Working Group, but here today we would like to welcome our speaker, Professor Shannon Monnat. We're very excited to have you here today. Professor Monnat is Associate Professor of Sociology at Leonard Chair of Public Health Promotion at Syracuse University. Dr. Monnat received her PhD in Sociology at the State University of New York at Albany in 2008. Prior to that, she was a faculty member for Nevada, Las Vegas, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and at Penn State University. As a scholar of social inequality and social demography, Dr. Monnat's research examines the correlates and consequences of social disadvantage, particularly at the intersection of place, public policy, and health. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natasha. My name is Shannon Monnat. I am delighted to be here today. I actually started participating in INET about 3.5 years ago, and I've found it to be the most innovative academic group in which I participate. The Young Scholars Initiative in particular is so exciting and inspiring, and I'm honored to be a part of this year's plenary. I'm a health demographer, and so it should come as no surprise that my 3 big questions focus on population health. The first question is, what have been the impacts of specific neoliberal policies like deregulation, devolution, and austerity budgets on health and life expectancy? But I also broke the rules a little bit here, and I have a couple of sub-questions to this big question. Which specific aspects of neoliberalism are the main contributors to the US divergence from peer countries in life expectancy? Is it the emphasis on markets? Is it the focus on individual responsibility? Decentralization of government? Is it deregulation of corporations, or is it some combination of these factors? And what kind of research would need to be done to really tease this out? Also, which sociodemographic groups have been harmed the most by these specific components? Have some policies harmed some groups more than others when it comes to health? Although the background and examples that I'll provide to contextualize these questions are focused on the US, these questions could really be applied to other high-income countries as well. The second big question is, what have been the impacts of place-level economic change on place-level population health and well-being? Are subnational spatial differences in life expectancy and other health outcomes driven by persistent place-level economic disadvantage, recent declines in economic conditions, or both groups of factors? A simpler way of asking this is population health worse in places that are persistently poor? Or is health equally as bad in places where economic opportunities have deteriorated over the past 4 decades? The third question is almost a full circle back to the first question. How do health and other forms of well-being impact civic engagement, trust in institutions, and voting patterns? So the first question is about how policies affect health, and the last question is about how health affects politics. So the first question, what have been the impacts of specific neoliberal policies on health and life expectancy? If we take a look at the US context, we can see why we might be concerned. Americans die younger than people in other high-income countries. As of 2018, we were dying 5.7 years younger than people in Japan, 3.4 years younger than our northern neighbors in Canada, and 2.7 years younger than our friends in the United Kingdom. US life expectancy would need to improve by 2.1 years just to be average among high-income countries. Now, this isn't new. It began in the early 1980s. At that time, US life expectancy was about in the middle of the pack, but then US gains started falling behind our peers. In 2010, US life expectancy plateaued, and in 2014, it actually began to decline, which was unprecedented. Excess mortality in the US this year from COVID-19 will only make the situation worse. To put it bluntly, the US has failed to thrive. If current trends continue, US life expectancy could fall more than any other country by 2040. Now, there have been plenty of speculation in the public discourse about the US life expectancy crisis, and it's tended to focus on the usual suspects: Americans' poor lifestyles, lack of universal health care, racial and ethnic inequities. But those factors don't explain these trends. Other speculation focuses on aspects of our current social, economic, and public health environment, but today's environment in today's policies cannot explain the emergence of the crisis 40 years ago. Now, what this graphic doesn't show is that the US decline in life expectancy has been driven by the working age population without a four-year college degree. The US actually performs quite well at older and younger ages relative to our peer countries, but does very poorly in the working age group. Moreover, life expectancy has continued to improve among adults with a four-year degree, but it's tanked among those without. So the real question we should be asking is, what happened starting at least 40 years ago to affect the life prospects of today's working age population without a four-year college degree? And how has that translated into worse health compared to prior generations? As one area of exploration, consider what's happened to real weekly earnings among people without a college degree in the US since the 1960s. While earnings have surged among those with a bachelor's degree or higher, they've remained stagnant among women and actually declined among men with less than a college degree. Which specific policies led to this divergence in earnings? Would simply reversing these policies now reverse these earnings trends, or do we need much larger macroeconomic change? Americans' chances for upward mobility, which is a key marker of the American dream, are in free fall. The probability that a child earns more than their parents at age 30 has declined in each successive birth cohort. Children born in the 1980s had about a 50% chance of earning more than their parents by age 30, compared to a 90% chance among children born in the 1940s. Again, to reflect back on the original big question, which macroeconomic policies have driven these trends, and how do they relate to deteriorating population health in the US? In the US, divergence between states is a big part of the story. This is from some research conducted by my colleague at Syracuse University, Dr. Jennifer Karras-Montes. In 1959, life expectancy was 71.1 years in both the states of Connecticut and Oklahoma. But by 2017, Connecticut had gained nearly 10 years in life expectancy, while Oklahoma gained only 4.7 years. The US life expectancy crisis is not so much a national crisis as it is a crisis within certain states. You can see a divergence opening up between high-performing and poor-performing states in the late 1980s. So what explains this divergence? Since the 1980s, state policy contexts have changed dramatically. States like Connecticut created contexts that provide vital resources for their residents through higher educational expenditures, higher minimum wages, tax credits for working adults, higher taxes on tobacco, relatively generous Medicaid programs, and much more. States like Oklahoma created contexts that provide few of those resources and even ban their cities and counties from doing so through a policy tool called preemption, where states restrict local levels of government from implementing their own policies. Of course, this policy divergence can be traced in large part to the growing influence of corporations, their lobbyists, and wealthy donors. In their research, they show that state policies since the 1970s, particularly after 2010, on issues such as tobacco, labor, immigration, civil rights, and the environment appear to be driving these state-level differences in life expectancy. After examining policy changes in all 50 states, they found that states with more left-leaning policies had better life expectancy outcomes compared to states where policies were more right-leaning. They estimated that US life expectancy would be 2.8 years longer among women and 2.1 years longer among men if all states shared the same health advantages of states with more liberal policies. Yet another study estimated that US life expectancy could improve by nearly 4 years if the US implemented the average social policy generosity of other rich democracies. So that was some context for the first big question. Now for the second question. We've long known that place, the environments in which we spend our lives, matters for health. This is the case not only in the US, but in other countries around the world. Now, less widely understood is that just as individual health manifests across our life course, places also have a life course. The past 4 decades have seen historically massive changes to the US economy, rising levels of income inequality, and reduced opportunity for upward mobility. These structural changes have been inherently spatial, leading to economic decimation in some places and prosperity in other places. Yet we know almost nothing about how these spatially variant structural changes have contributed to spatially variant declines in life expectancy generally, and rising rates of mortality from specific causes of death. What have been the impacts of within-country place-level economic change on place-level population health and well-being? Although the US national trends I showed earlier are startling all on their own, those national trends actually mask growing and even more startling geographic disparities in life expectancy and mortality in the US. For example, since 1980, life expectancy has increased by a whopping 15 years in New York City, but declined by 3 years in rural Owsley County, Kentucky. On these maps, the blue shaded counties are where mortality rates have declined since 1990. The red and pink shaded counties are where mortality rates have increased since 1990. What these maps show is that while urban coastal cities have generally experienced large declines in working age mortality rates have surged in parts of America's heartland that were once hubs for secure working class jobs in manufacturing and mining. Trends for the younger working age group, 25 to 44, are especially startling. This shows trends for women. Trends for men are a bit less pronounced, but the geographic differences are quite similar. Nationwide, the main contributor to rising mortality rates in the US has been drug overdoses, due primarily to opioids. In a National Academy of Sciences committee that I'm on, we found that drug overdose is the only cause of death that increased for both men and women and for all major racial ethnic groups in the US from 1990 through 2017. Other causes have also contributed to both the US decline in life expectancy and the widening within US variation in life expectancy, like cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, alcohol-related causes, and suicide. But drug overdoses have been the largest contributor in the younger working age group. And as you can see, the increase in drug overdoses hasn't occurred equally across the US. Some places have been hit especially hard, while others have been somewhat immune. COVID-19 is only exacerbating these existing trends. In my own research, I've shown that the opioid overdose crisis manifested from a perfect storm of underlying vulnerability and increased exposure to highly lethal substances, both of which were driven by a neoliberal policy regime that protects profits over people. My research shows that net of opioid supply factors, there are 3 main groups of factors that explain why drug mortality rates are higher in some US counties than others. Those factors are related to labor market changes, family structure, and community infrastructure. So work, family, and the community. Why these 3? Well, I think it's simple. These are the 3 arenas to which we attach the most meaning in our lives. If these institutions are missing, or if we've become disconnected from them, we're at risk of falling into some troubling coping habits. What connects the 3 of these, in my mind, is isolation, disconnection and dislocation from the very institutions where we derive meaning in our lives. Thanks to the effects of 40 plus years of spatially divergent economic restructuring and disinvestment in our institutions and our social infrastructure, some places in the US were primed to be more vulnerable than others to opioids. Opioids are drugs that temporarily numb both physical and psychological pain. But what if the opioid crisis is simply a canary in the coal mine for other troubling trends in population health? After all, economic marginalization means increased exposure to many different types of health-harming environments. Since 2010, we've seen reversals in causes of death that have been in decline for the past 2 decades, including heart disease and homicide. And there have been recent small but important increases in other causes of death, including suicide, alcohol-related diseases, and obesity-related diseases. Due to their lethality, opioids kill people quickly, But what if the underlying kindling of the surge in fatal drug overdoses, that is, the market and politically driven economic, family, and social changes that we've seen, are the same underlying factors driving recent trends in other causes of death? If so, that would tell us that rather than chasing after some unique explanations and cures for specific diseases that manifest at any given time, we should tackle the upstream structural drivers of premature mortality. And now we have COVID-19, which has shined a bright light on existing health inequities. During the early stages of COVID-19 in the US, we found that states with higher shares of Black and poor residents had lower COVID-19 testing rates. These states are also the least healthy states in the US. This is a major concern given that the populations in these unhealthier states are at the greatest risk of serious complications and death from coronavirus. COVID-19 not only reveals, but also exacerbates large health disparities across US states. If we look just at the maps to the far right, these are the COVID-19 case and mortality rates, we can see clear spatial clustering. With the exception of the New York City metro area, which in many ways is its own special case, both case and mortality rates have been highest in places with the largest concentrations of racial ethnic minorities, Blacks in the South, Hispanics in Southern Texas and Arizona, American Indians in the Northern Plains. If we compare a map of county level poverty rates to COVID-19 case rates and mortality rates in the US, we can see it matches up pretty closely. This shouldn't be a surprise. The poorest states are comprised of populations with the worst health and the worst healthcare access. And these are the same states where testing has been paltry and where state governors have been slow or reluctant to enact mask wearing mandates and physical distancing protocols. We're going to be researching the impacts of COVID-19 for years to come. And I encourage us to not ignore the role of subnational place level factors in that research. For the third question, we sort of come full circle from the first big question. So recall that the first question was about the roles of macro level policies on health. This third question is about the impact of population health on politics. Addressing the spatial inequities in population health that I've shown so far is important because vibrancy and optimism and indeed democracy are under threats in contexts with concentrated sickness and death. So the third question is, how do health and other forms of well-being impact civic engagement, trust in institutions, and voting patterns? Shortly after the 2016 presidential election, I did some research to identify the regions of the US and the characteristics of places where Donald Trump not only won, but also performed much better than expected. That is, much better than the Republican candidate from 4 years earlier, Mitt Romney. As we all now know, it was Trump's advantage in small cities and rural areas in the industrial Midwest, namely Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that were key to Trump's unanticipated victory in 2016. Now, I had to submit these slides before we knew what the outcome of the 2020 election would be, and now we know. And it's noteworthy that all three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, went for Joe Biden in 2020. But many of the counties Trump flipped or unexpectedly won by large margins in 2016 stuck with him this time around. The voting map shows significant spatial dependence and overlap. We see a clear clustering of voting behaviors with stark overperformance in the very places that experienced substantial economic downturns over the past 2 decades. Now, this isn't confined to rural areas. Indeed, some parts of the rural US have actually done pretty well. But small and medium-sized cities have been hurt by decades of industrial restructuring, state budget cuts, and disinvestment in services. The Great Recession only exacerbated long-term trends. These places went for Trump in 2016, and many of them stuck with him in 2020. The point is that despair and hopelessness have far-reaching consequences beyond our health. This shows how much Trump overperformed in the 2016 election among counties with proxies of different types of despair: economic, health, family. Across every measure of despair, Trump performed better in places with more of it. He did better in places with the most economic distress, the worst health, the lowest educational attainment, and the most marital dissolution. Other research has shown a similar pattern. Changes in county life expectancy from 1980 to 2014 were strongly negatively associated with Trump's vote share, with less support for Trump in counties experiencing greater survival gains. Counties in which life expectancy stagnated or declined saw a 10 percentage point increase in the Republican vote share between 2008 and 2016. So what are the implications of continued declines in life expectancy for voting behaviors? Are voters in places that are characterized by more death and more despair vulnerable to certain kinds of candidates and messaging? Ironically, of the 100 counties with the highest COVID-19 death rates per capita, 68 had a higher proportion of votes cast for Trump this cycle than they did in 2016. This includes both Republican-leaning counties and counties that supported Joe Biden. Even in the case of a massive public health crisis, places where people saw death around them were still more likely to go for Trump. What are the mechanisms through which this is happening? What are the specific mechanisms through which health and other forms of well-being impact democracy, trust in institutions, and voting patterns? And with that, I'll stop talking, and I look forward to hearing the questions that emerge from this topic.
Thank you, Professor Monnat. We kind of lost your image right now, but we'll see what the tech people can do. That was very elucidative. It explains a lot what happened in the 2020 election, which is really good. And especially, it's a super important topic this year, in this moment, while we are all living this pandemics. It's a new thing for everyone, so your research is super important. We've got some questions here from the audience. I would like to, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, good. So I would like to read to you the first question. Question 1 says, what socioeconomic factors have left communities most vulnerable to the pandemic?
That's an excellent question. And I think that there's plenty of research to do in this area. So, to think about the various components of this question, you can think about what has been the role of poverty. Has it just been poverty, or has it been long-term decline in economic conditions that have left some communities more vulnerable than others? In the case of the rural U.S., rural counties in the U.S. have seen 126 hospitals close just since 2010. Now, that's a lot of hospitals. That means some counties in the rural U.S. don't have any hospitals at all. And so that's another component, right? So you have the actual sort of material resources that may matter, but you also have the healthcare infrastructure that might matter. So I love that question. I think there's a lot of work to do there.
Certainly is. Let's see the second question. What are the most effective ways to support communities that have been disadvantaged as a result of globalization?
Another really strong question, right? So this gets down to whether we need different policies in general, or whether there are particular types of economic resources that need to be invested in certain types of communities. Are we talking about just spending a lot of money? Or are there other things, policies and practices that we can look to in the most disadvantaged communities to try to improve life conditions in them, right? There seems to always be this conflict between spending money and promoting population health. Maybe that there are things that can be done that either don't require spending a whole lot more money, or just is a matter of reallocating existing resources.
That's true. Let's see question 3. How has the public health crisis impacted democracy? Is there a difference in urban and rural areas?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this question. It really is reflective of that third big question, right? So what aspects of population health seem to have the most influence on our democratic processes and outcomes? So we've seen these huge, massive attacks on our institutions, right? On the way that a lot of Americans and also, residents of other countries perceive science, or the media, the sort of trust that they have in these institutions to tell them what's actually happening and to then convince them to engage in behaviors that are good for public health, like wearing masks, for example, or avoiding crowds. And so is it the case that places that have just seen sort of long-term disadvantage and decline, or that feel like they've been ignored, or that have a lot of pessimism, that lack optimism, are the same places that are the most distrustful of our institutions? And if so, what are sort of the long-term effects of national level politics when certain places seem to have a much more, a much greater impact on our electoral outcomes than others? You know, it seems like every single presidential election, we're looking at a handful of states because of the Electoral College in the US, a handful of states that matter more than all the others. And so, you know, we should really be paying attention to the not only the economic outcomes in those states, but also the health outcomes and the role that they're playing in not only how individuals vote, but how entire places tend to move on the political spectrum, or don't for that matter. So are there some places that just have lower voter turnout because of poor health? It's not just choosing a candidate, it's also choosing not to participate in our civic institutions at all.
Yes, that's true. We all learned a lot about the American electoral process this last few weeks, and it's kind of different from the rest of the world. I would like also to ask another question. Do you think that the information you showed us today is about the United States, and from the high-income countries, United States has the worst COVID numbers? Do you think that this is also affecting other countries? I mean, other high-income countries?
Yeah, so in terms of rephrasing that into a research question, right, one could compare countries across similar demographic and economic measures and see how COVID-19 case and mortality rates are the same or are not. And so I guess, you know, what is the distinguishing feature or features of the US that explain why we seem to be performing so poorly relative to our peer countries? Does it have to do with healthcare infrastructure? Probably not, right? We spend a lot of money in the US. Does it have to do with American attitudes of individualism rather than an emphasis or a concern with collective well-being? So, right, like I can choose to wear a mask because it's my health, my life, but it's some kind of a violation of civil liberties to require everybody to wear a mask. Or requiring everybody to stay at home or avoid gatherings is somehow an attack on our freedoms. And that's a very kind of American ideal. And so, you know, is it that sort of ideology that helps to explain differences across different countries? Does it have to do with differences in states? You know, if you go back to that second big question, or even first big question about differences between states and policies that are enacted, that happened with COVID as well. So some state governors were really quick to enact physical distancing protocols, mask wearing requirements, the temporary closure of certain types of businesses to reduce the spread. It really worked in New York State, where I'm located. So, you know, people in upstate New York, very rural areas, were upset about a lot of this. A lot of business owners were upset, but you saw New York State's case rates plummet after these policies were implemented. Meanwhile, other states like Georgia, for example, the governor prevented the mayor of Atlanta from enacting mask wearing requirements and physical distancing requirements to protect the people in the city of Atlanta. The governor of Georgia actually preempted local city level policies. And so you see a lot of variation like this across the United States. So there are any number of different factors that you could research in terms of what explains the US's poor performance relative to its peer countries that have to do with economic conditions, healthcare conditions, policy level factors, any and all of which might be explaining these differences that we're seeing now.
True. So I'm from Brazil, and we can see that in my country as well. The subnational governors, each one had their own policies to deal with COVID, and our president wasn't really helpful with that. I mean, each time he would say something. So the subnational governments were really important, and we can see that in the numbers of COVID, that it started in a few states that had more travel coming from abroad, especially in the beginning of the year, and then these few states started to, what can I say, limit people, crowds, and asked everyone to use masks. And then the other states were, oh, okay, we're fine, we don't have to do anything. So COVID, we can see among our map, the Brazilian map, that COVID was switching between states. So maybe the numbers of the country were steady, but some states had a big reduction while other states had a huge increase.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the same thing that's happening here, right? So COVID started, thrashing urban areas in the US. New York City was among the first hit, and rural areas thought that they were going to be immune to this problem. And now we can see that the highest increases in case rates over the last several weeks have been in rural areas, and precisely the states where governors failed to react quickly, or not even failed to react, but actually fought vociferously against the sorts of policies that were being enacted in states with large cities. And so, a potentially interesting research question or a hypothesis one might derive is, did countries with a more centralized strategy, a more national unified strategy against COVID-19, did they perform better in the long run than countries where we have more decentralized governments, where, for example, states or other subnational units have significant control over the policies that they implement? Which types of countries did better in a condition of a global infectious disease outbreak?
Yes, totally. For a smaller country, maybe that's easier, right? Than for us that we live in huge continental countries. Now, one more question from the audience. If we can already say, how has the pandemic impacted national health indicators, such as life expectancy, mental health, substance abuse? Do we already have information on this?
We have some anecdotal information, right? So I'm not supposed to answer the question, I'm supposed to rephrase it. So that's a great question, right? And so one of the ways that you can test that question is to, early on, before we have access to the actual mortality data, is just to look at excess mortality rates. That's what a lot of researchers are doing, right? So they compare the mortality rates that we're seeing now to what we saw over a similar period of time in the last couple of years. And so you can see how many more deaths on average countries are experiencing right now relative to previous years. And some of those are going to be attributable to COVID, and some of those are going to be attributable to other causes. I think that this is a critical question, right? Because this won't be the first time that there's a global infectious disease outbreak. And we're all kind of just coming at this from the seat of our pants right now. There was really no cohesive strategy ahead of time about what to do when there's a global disease outbreak. Do you close down a bunch of businesses? Do you keep certain types of people at home and let other people go about their regular business? How do you prevent the spread? And then how do you prevent the disease from becoming as deadly as what it's been, while also not crashing the economy? So I think, research that focuses on the trade-offs between the closures of certain of our economic institutions while we were trying to protect population health will be especially important. And if we can show that it's not really a trade-off at all, but that protecting population health is tightly intersected with economic well-being, then I think we're in a much better position moving forward on how to address future global disease outbreaks. I don't think it's a dichotomy. I don't think it's a choice between protecting the economy and protecting population health. People who are healthy are good for the economy, right? Healthy workers are productive workers. Healthy consumers buy more stuff and they go out and consume more product. They go to bars, they go to restaurants. And if we want residents to feel comfortable enough to engage in those behaviors, then we got to bring case rates down. And so research that aims to show that, places that got the virus under control more quickly did better economically in the long run would go a long way toward showing countries and states what they need to do when this happens again to avoid this fight that we seem to be having about whether we should protect the economy or protect health, because it's the same thing.
Totally agree with you. It's not a matter of trade-off. We have to do both at the same time. Well, we have some more questions here. What should be the main post-pandemic economic policy to avoid the same bad results?
Yeah, I love that question. So, is it one or two policies that are really going to matter? Is it a basket of policies that intersect that are really going to matter? Again, trying to take this back to which states, which countries performed best and why. I think, we're going to have probably, the Great Recession hit. We're still doing research on the Great Recession. We're still going to be doing research on the causes and impacts of COVID for a decade or more to come. And so, we're going to know the long-term effects that this has had beyond just the number of people who died this year and the number of people who died next year. We're already seeing that COVID-19 has likely reduced fertility rates. So it might lead to overall population loss in certain places, not so much because of the number of people who died, but more so because of the lack of children being born during this period of time, right? So how has COVID not only affected mortality, but also fertility? How has COVID-19 affected migration, both within countries and between countries? And which policies would have mitigated these effects? And which policies and choices that states and countries made exacerbated the effects of COVID in ways that we wouldn't have seen if they had made better policy choices?
Sure, that's correct. One last question. Have you seen examples of small cities or rural areas pursuing post-neoliberal economic policies? I mean, pursuing development that isn't contingent on the global economy?
Another great question. So, I like to think about what are some examples of places that have done much better in terms of population health than what we would expect based upon various demographic and economic characteristics. So are there places in the US and the other countries that should have higher rates of mortality, all-cause mortality, cause-specific mortality than they do? And if so, why? What can we learn from those places that has been effective at preventing population health decline or even improving population health, places that are doing much better now than they were maybe 2 decades ago? What happened in those places? State level policy, health and economic policy, different types of labor market conditions, different mechanisms for reducing or preventing inequality. These are all important questions to ask, because if we can learn lessons from these places, then maybe we can scale them and implement them at a much larger level.
Totally, we can sure learn a lot from this moment. I am a PhD researcher of inequality myself, and I see a bunch of potential researchers in the near future.
That's great.
So with that, the first part of this session is a wrap, but the second part is about to begin. But first, let us go back to the studio.
Thank you, Natasja, and thank you, Shannon, for helping us comment on such great questions. Thanks to all of you for suggesting them. The session's not over yet. Now is our time to refine the questions that you brought to the table and figure out together which ones we're going to be adding to the constellation today. So for that, over back to you.
Thank you for that fascinating and timely discussion. We received a lot of interesting questions. Professor Monnat has already commented on our most liked questions. However, even good questions can be improved by being more precisely, adequately, or inspiringly formulated. And that is our task for this part of the session. The point is to work collaboratively on alternative phrasings to improve them as research questions before they join the other guiding stars in the globalization constellation. Everyone is now encouraged to suggest new phrasings, and we'll go one by one and work together on each question at a time. We're now open for discussion, so please raise your hand on Zoom to be unmuted to give your input, and I look forward to hearing from you. The first question we have is, how has the public health crisis impacted democracy? Does it differ in urban and rural areas? I'll give you guys a few minutes to write your rephrasings, or feel free to jump in if you want to talk about a rephrasing. Okay, it looks like we have a rephrasing. So to what extent do place-based economic conditions impact national elections? You know, I'd say that's on topic. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts as to whether that might be its own question, or we can leave it down there and I'll let you use your hearts. So the question that was initially submitted that Professor Monnat had talked about, that will have the most hearts right now, but you can distribute your hearts among the rephrase questions. And all right, and that one has one more heart. I'll give you guys a few more minutes to submit your rephrasings. Well, we can talk about the next question while we wait for the rephrasings to come through. What are the most effective ways to support communities that have been disadvantaged as a result of globalization? Well, I think that's just a great question in general. It has, you know, policy implications and it's forward-looking. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on how we could make that a better question. Well, I will move on to the question below while you still submit your rephrasings, because I think that the two questions kind of play in together. What socioeconomic factors have left communities most vulnerable to the pandemic? So I'm gonna, I highlighted the wrong one. There. Oh, I like this. We have a new rephrasing. So what socioeconomic factors have left communities most vulnerable to economic shocks? I think that's a much broader question, and I think that's going to get my heart. My heart, you know. And I think it takes the lead. So, where did you go? Well, now it's even. So we got a little race, a little action going on over here. All right. And please feel free to submit your rephrasings. You can unmute yourself if you want to, you know, if you just want to talk about it instead of writing it in. But while you're submitting your rephrasings, we can move on to the next question, which is how has the pandemic impacted national health indicators such as life expectancy, mental health, and substance abuse? So Professor Monnat had kind of already commented on this, that it's an important question. We have some preliminary data, but I wonder if we can't rephrase this in a few more minutes. Oh, let me highlight it. There we go. Thank you. Well, while you're thinking about that question, let's move on to the next question. The last question that Professor Monnat commented on was, what should be the main post-pandemic economic policy to avoid the same bad results? I think that's a great question, and I think, Martin, I think you might have asked that. If you want to talk about it, we can, or maybe submit a. Anybody has any ideas for rephrasing this question? I really like the question because it's forward-looking, and I think your English is great. Let me see, what should be the main? What if we broaden the question instead of the main post? Well, I don't know. What do you guys think about the question? Should it be the main post-pandemic economic policy? Maybe we can talk about the different agendas. What Shannon Monnat talked about a little bit of comparing Connecticut and I think it was Oklahoma, and how she said how they in Connecticut, they invested in social programs and they were really investing in their community, and Oklahoma took an approach of, I guess you would, austerity and not letting different policies come in, and we can kind of see how that played out. So maybe that is one way to look at it. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts. Want to jump in here? You know, another rephrasing we could do is just, oops, sorry, shit. I'm sorry, hang on. Sorry. Abby? Oh. Yeah. Thank you, Martin. I appreciate that. It is. Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to resubmit the question without the notes because I think that your English is just fine. So I'm going to go and add it under there, and I'm going to give that question my heart. So the same one. It looks like I have too many windows open. If somebody else wants to give that a try, jump on in there. Well, we do have one more question in there that Shannon Monnat hadn't discussed. If we want to talk about it, I am open. And yeah. Oh, Brennan, I see you're here. Do you have any input on the questions?
Hi there. Well, I was just actually writing you a note, Audra, to say that I had a
oh, that's
scheduling
okay.
issue.
That's okay. We can just talk about the questions.
Yeah. Well, and I was also saying in my note that I thought you were doing just a beautiful job with moderation, and so my heart came back to normal beating as soon as I came in.
Well, I am so glad to hear that, and I'm glad you're here. And just in time, we have another rephrasing for our top question, which it was originally phrased is, how has the public health crisis impacted democracy? Does it differ in urban and rural areas? And then we have a rephrasing that, is democracy resilient to external crises? Good. Yeah, well, I like that. That definitely takes the question a lot broader. It really opens it up. And I guess let me see if I can.
It'd be interesting as well to say something about how can democracy be made more resilient to crises like this one, and perhaps other external crises, sort of combining the core ideas there.
I like that. Yeah, that is true. That does broaden it up. I like that point. Do you want to try to submit a rephrasing for that?
Sure.
And then we can all talk and vote and. Well, I'm gonna give everybody a few minutes to redistribute their hearts on the different questions. Brennan, I personally really like what you've done with the questions, so I move my heart there. And so it looks like, well, as we discussed before, we did have a question change here. We opened up the third question to vulnerable to economic shocks, and that is a winner. And I'm probably gonna turn off the new phrasings here pretty soon, unless someone objects. And then once we do that, we can you'll now notice that there is a star to the left of your question. And that star is for you to pick your top 10 favorite questions throughout the sessions, and that'll be listed to the left of your screen. So I'll give you guys a few moments to favorite these questions. And then we will move back to Thomas in the studio.
Thank you, Audra. And we're back, so we can see the entire questions graph here now and get an overview of all the stuff that had happened today. This was the last session in the questions fair. We're not completely over with the day, but this was the last question fair session. And now we can see how much stuff has happened as the plenary evolves. Some of these stars are going to get bigger. We're putting more and more questions in. We're noticing that there's a few people liking, but there's still not a lot of favorites coming in. So even though we have until Sunday to place our favorites, you can already go in and influence the race right now by putting in your favorites. And don't worry, if better questions come up and you go to sessions before Sunday that has new questions, you can still change your favorites. You can just never do more than 10, but if you want to change them later on, that's fine. In order for this exercise to work, we know it's a big experiment. We hope that you're all going to buy in on it, and we hope that you're going to come in, explore the graph. It's all available on the YSI plenary platform, and see which questions you'd like to favorite. Make sure to do it before Sunday, but basically as soon as possible. The questions we see down here, those are the questions we just submitted in the Globalization constellation with Shannon Monnat. So yeah, let's go to the future of the role of economists. Is that what we have here? If you scroll all the way up to the top, yeah. So after the session with Jacob Capella earlier, a lot of new questions were being submitted, and now we can see what are the most favorited questions in the constellation based on like those who have already been into favorite. There's so few favorites so far that just placing one or two more favorites is actually going to change this order. But the leading question is, how do we make economics and economies truly inclusive? That's a question that was posed yesterday by Julie Nelson. The second most favorited question is, what are the social implications of data mining, which is a question that we also posed, I think it was to Akerlof on the very first day in the first question session with him. Then the third most is a question by another question by Julie Nelson, recognizing the biases implicit mainstream economic thought. How can we build a better discipline of economics? Yeah. So if you think these should be the research questions for YSI to focus on, well, then you kind of don't have to do anything. You can go in. But if you find that some of the ones further down the list are more interesting, then go in and place a favorite so that we can get a better list. Yeah, and you can find all these questions within the constellations. First you find the whole graph, then you click into the constellation. Now, after the session with Capella, we continued with another session in Globalization, the one we just finished with Monnat. So if we click into the Globalization constellation, there we go. And it looks like there's still a session in progress, but we just ended that. And now we can choose up in the corner here to sort by most favorited, most recent, most liked, but we're now looking at most favorited. And the question in this constellation that has been the most favorited is, to what extent is the discipline of economics a part of the problem itself? That was one of the very first questions, because we got it in the very first session with Joe Stiglitz, and that is also the one that has, maybe it has an advantage because it was one of the first questions that came in, so it has a little bit longer time to gain the favorites. But people, if they change their mind later on, they can retract it. The second most favorite question is, what is the appropriate role of the state in the process of economic development and transition in a market economy? And that is a question by Justin Lin, who hasn't spoken yet, but his question is already in the graph, so you can go in there and favorite it. Okay, so tomorrow is going to be Social Wednesday, but we are not ending the questions fair yet. The sessions in the questions fair is going on again from Thursday, but starting tomorrow morning, we're going to have a new type of question session. We call them question submissions. So the question submissions does not have an input talk, anyone to hear, but you can still go in and simply suggest questions at your own time. This is because you might have questions that are not relevant to a specific talk, but you still think they should have a chance and they should be in the questions graph and they should be for the consideration of others. So starting tomorrow morning, look for the question submission sessions. You have 3 hours to submit questions, and towards the end of that, like for the last 45 minutes, we will be placing likes and rephrasings and so on, but this is ample time for you to submit what you want. Yeah. Finally, the day is not over yet. This was the last session in the questions fair, but we're going to get some updates from the working groups. I know that the Finance, Law and Economics group is going to call us in from their ship. Maybe some of the other working groups want to tell us what they're up to, and that will happen in approximately 40 minutes, and it will be the last thing that's going to happen today. Okay, so see you in 40 minutes.